Okay, so hello, everybody. Today is the 15th of June of 2021. My name is Pablo Ruiz, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our Institute's Colloquium here at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. As you may have noticed, today's colloquium is a bit different from the ones that we had over the last few months. And some things, of course, will remain the same as in the last few sessions. As always, you will be able to queue up your questions or share your thoughts on today's talk by using the Etherpad link that should appear in your chat box just about now. And you will be able to access our Internet Library Corner from there as usual. The Q&A will be moderated by myself and by Institute's Colloquium co-organizer Stephanie Hood. And just like in the last few months, we will be recording today's talk, but not the Q&A session. But today's Institute Colloquium is different in a very important regard. Our speaker today is our very own Katja Krause, the leader of the Max Planck Research Group on experience in the premodern sciences of soul and body. And as you might remember, Katja's talk was scheduled to take place last year, right before the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the Institute's life, along with pretty much everything else, both here and worldwide. And you might also remember that last year's Institute's Colloquium series had the title History of Science right here, right now. So the idea back then, if you remember, and if you weren't here, this will probably be a useful reminder. So the idea back then was to use the Institute's Colloquium to get to know the work of our very own researchers, people doing research here at the Institute's Colloquium a bit better. And part of the idea as well was to encourage interactions between the different departments and research groups here at the Institute, and hopefully to facilitate constructive exchanges between them. So that should explain then the format and the slight differences between this session of the Institute's Colloquium and the previous ones. And so what I have to ask you to do right now is to sort of travel back in time with me. Imagine that this is still, what, 2020? Has been no pandemic so far, and what I'm doing is kind of engaging in this exercise of introducing Katja and using that as an exercise to get to know her work a bit better, and also think about how her work might relate to my own and the work we do at the research group that I belong to. So it is in that spirit that I wrote the short introductory remarks that I'm about to deliver. So please close your eyes and follow me in this travel through time, and please take this admittedly somewhat longer introduction with that in mind. Okay. Katja Krause received her PhD in 2014 from King's College London, with a dissertation on Aquinas' theory of beatific vision. This early work anticipated some themes that figure prominently in her current research, including the evolution of Aristotelian theories of perception and cognition, and the status of scientific knowledge within this tradition. After obtaining her PhD, Katja was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship here at the Institute, where she spent 2 years in Department 2, which was back then, of course, under the direction of Professor Lorraine Daston. During her time at the Institute, Katja started a new research project that investigated the rise of empiricism in the Latin West during the so-called Averroist turn of the 13th century. This project was launched with the explicit aim of rewriting conventional narratives of the rise of modern science. According to these narratives, empiricism would have appeared in the West only during the early modern period, and only as part of a series of broader developments that transform human beings' understanding of their place in nature. Katja's focus was on a different kind of empiricism, which had risen well before the early modern period, and found in Averroes, Albert the Great, and Thomas Aquinas, among others, some of its main proponents. Katja's crucial insight already back then was that this new kind of empiricism was rooted not in the laws of nature, as we would call them nowadays, but on the laws that govern the human mind and the human soul. Since 2018, Katja has continued to investigate related issues as the leader of the Max Planck Research Group on experience in the premodern sciences of soul and body. The projects of the various members of her research group inquire into the different roles that experience played in grounding knowledge of living creatures during the medieval period. These research projects engage with a very diverse set of topics that cover a large chronological span, essentially the entire Middle Ages, and different philosophical traditions. So not just the Latin tradition, but also the Islamic and Jewish traditions. In this manner, they complement Katja's own work on 13th century Western Europe. What I have said so far, however, is nothing new. All of this could have been discerned by an attentive reader simply by consulting the website of our institute. And I must confess, in fact, that this is part of the method that I followed in order to prepare this short introduction to Katja's talk. But as I inquired into Katja's work back in the day, I came to appreciate some aspects of it that I hadn't noticed before and that I have come to admire greatly. These have to do with the manner in which she approaches the history of science. And I wanted to make sure that I say a few things about this, even if that means that we will have to wait a bit longer to hear what Katja herself has to say. What I find most inspiring about Katja's work is the manner in which she situates herself at the intersection between the history of philosophy and the history of science, two disciplines that are not as similar to each other as one might imagine. By drawing from the resources of both of these disciplines, Katja is able to produce new insights about the nature of early science and about the different ways in which it was grounded in experience. Take, for instance, Katja's use of the notion of an actor's category as a tool to retell the history of experience, the very topic of her talk today, if I'm not mistaken. Here we have an analytic tool that is common currency in the history of science and which has been deployed to intervene and to intervene fruitfully in debates that pertain to the history of philosophy, where the notion of an actor category is not as common or methodologically as meaningful. In some ways, Katja's own synthetic approach to the history of science and the history of philosophy can be seen not just as a source of insight, which it is, but as a necessary condition for engaging with her subject matter. The tradition of 13th century Aristotelianism that Katja studies, after all, admitted of no distinction between science and philosophy, and our very use of these terms, indeed, would be alien to these medieval thinkers. And how else is one to engage with knowledge as it existed during this period, but by drawing from the resources of both the history of science and the history of philosophy. From this perspective, Katja's approach to her subject matter appears as a deliberate methodological effort to attain a kind of understanding that would otherwise elude us. It appears to me, in fact, that Katja's research can be seen as an elucidation of what it means to do research in the history of science, as a kind of endeavor that focuses on the production and sustainment of a very specific kind of knowledge, namely scientific knowledge. And implicitly as well, as a reflection on why doing research on the history of science is important. If one pursues this train of thought a bit further, then several compelling points about the nature of the history of science become visible. The first one is that we can't just assume that we know what scientific knowledge is. Scientific knowledge needs to be constituted as it exists in a given period and in the context of a certain tradition. It is in order to get at what science means in a given context that we mobilize the resources of whatever disciplines might promise to be of help, in order to understand not just science, but science as it existed and as it was made possible by the Aristotelian tradition of the 13th century, for instance. We make use of the resources offered by the history of philosophy and the history of science in their current incarnations as contemporary academic disciplines. I see Katja's work as an attempt to accomplish this much, and it really is a lot to accomplish. It is precisely because scientific knowledge cannot be taken for granted that we can't really anticipate what the outcome of Katja's research will be. We can't really tell ahead of time what science meant for Albert the Great or for John Burden. For the time and period that she investigates, however, I think that it is reasonable to suspect that matters of purpose and finality will turn out to be important to what science means. A reasonable working hypothesis, then, is that for Albert the Great and for John Burden, it would have been meaningless to conceive of science without asking themselves the question of what science is for. This, of course, is nothing but a working hypothesis, but I think that it is a reasonable one. And I think that Katja would agree. This picture that I have just sketched might be a little simplistic, admittedly, but I think that it can be helpful in illuminating ways in which the work pursued by the different departments and research groups at the Institute relate to each other. So I was told back in the day that stimulating these kinds of reflections is part of what we wanted to achieve with last year's Institute's Colloquium. So I will elaborate on this point for just a little longer. So I hope that you will bear with me as I do that. Just a moment ago, I said that the notion of scientific knowledge cannot be taken for granted. It needs to be constituted. It is in order to understand how a certain kind of scientific knowledge is made possible in a given period by a given group of people, and in order to understand how that specific kind of knowledge evolves and is transferred, appropriated, or otherwise transformed, that we do work on the history of science. So I explain now, in my view, one can see, I also explain how, in my view, one can see Katja's research as an attempt to use the resources offered by the history of philosophy and the history of science to get at what science means in a certain time and place. The question that naturally arises at this point is, what is it that the other departments and research groups at the Institute, and in particular the one that I belong to, do when we look at them from this conception of the history of science that I have just outlined? How do those different articulations of the history of science relate to each other? And can they be made to interact and interact fruitfully with each other? I will try to answer these questions very briefly by drawing from the work that we do in the research group that I belong to, which is the Max Planck Research Group on historical epistemology of the final theory program. This was convenient back in the day because the leader of my research group, Alexander Bloom, had given a talk at the Institute's Colloquium of last year, just a few months before Katja's talk was scheduled. But as you might remember from Alex's talk last year, the research that we do in our group can be seen as engaging with perennial questions, basic questions such as those inquiring into the nature of consciousness or the origin of the universe. Alex's talk, for instance, focused on the question of what the world is made of. And if you remember what happened back then, an important lesson that we learned from Alex's talk is that when it comes to the historical period that we investigate in our group, the 20th century, this question finds a very specific, highly technical formulation in terms of contemporary physics. The kinds of questions of answers of this question can be expected to admit of, in fact, depend greatly on the precise mathematical framework that we use to formulate them. It really is the very concrete technical puzzles that result from this that guides the evolution of the eternal questions. It seems safe to say then that for the time period and tradition that our research group engages with, mathematics becomes constitutive of knowledge. It makes up its very fabric. And it is to the sciences themselves, in the case of modern physics, that we turn in order to articulate how this very specific kind of science was made possible during the 20th century by a very specific set of people. I'm about to conclude. And so we thus arrive at a picture in which two different research groups investigate two different forms of science, those that were made possible by the Aristotelian tradition of the 13th century and by the fundamental strand in contemporary physics. And we find that they do so by drawing from very different disciplines, which are the history of philosophy on the one hand and physics on the other. An obvious question to ask at this point is that of how we got from A to B, and of how science went from being inextricably linked with questions of purpose and finality to being a matter of very concrete mathematical puzzles. The question indeed of how the shape of the perennial questions that Alex mentioned in his talk back in the day was transformed over the course of the centuries, starting with their original formulation in terms of 13th century Aristotelianism and finishing with their current versions as open research questions in contemporary physics. This is a big question to ask, of course, but it is also one that I hope we can take up soon. And there are some obvious starting points too, such as those having to do with the dialectic between reduction and emergence, or with current debates on non-empirical physics. This is only a very crude picture that I've managed to paint in here, but I hope that at least some of my suggestions were compelling. I have also taken enough of your time already, and you must be eager to hear what Katja has to say about the history of science. So without further ado, let me introduce the speaker of today's Institute's Colloquium, Katja Krause.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for those very generous and actually insightful words of introduction. It's quite something to hear such, different words about oneself as one would conceive of oneself, I suppose. And it's, as I said, very, very generous of you to introduce me in this way. But it's not just you, Pablo, to whom I would like to extend my thanks. It's first and foremost all members of my group who I would like to thank here before I begin my talk for the critical questions, the thorough discussions that we've been having, and the ongoing creative thinking that we're doing about our sources. I would also like to thank the events team for making all this possible online in such a wonderful and smooth way. And hopefully the fact that I'm at the Institute will contribute to the smoothness of the running of today's session. But last but not least, I would also like to thank the audience of today. I'd like to thank everyone who's present here and who will hopefully accompany me into what's supposed to be the beginning of a new debate that will hopefully inspire everyone who's here and many more people not attending today. Inspire you in such a way that it will unite you in new ways of fruitful interaction of thinking about our discipline, the history of science. Okay, I'm going to start my talk, and Pablo is very kind to lead us through the PowerPoint because my computer was just updated to a new Apple system or whatever, and didn't want to do what I wanted it to do. Anyway, okay, what history of science to write? What history of science is good to write and why? What role can early science play in such a history? And how does our work on experience in early science contribute to writing such a good history of science and why? The aim of my talk today is to address these three big questions. Address, maybe not answer. So the first question concerns the discipline of the history of science as a whole and its future shape. Current trends in the history of science reveal a constant expansion of themes and approaches. Two big themes of globalization and colonialism forcefully impressed their stamp on large parts of the next generation of historians of science. They aspire to move away from a history of science that was overwhelmingly centered on Europe and instead to give a voice to the many unheard voices, to replace a Eurocentrist view of science by a nuanced understanding of science around the globe. New approaches to the history of science, this time from the natural sciences, also grow on the horizon. They aspire to revolutionize our thinking, not just about science, but about the relationship between humans and nature. They hold that human technology has changed nature to the extent that natural developments are man-made. Both trends in the history of science aim to remedy perceived shortcomings of older histories of science, and Friedrich Nietzsche would probably wish to seek the origin of the good in both of them. I'm certainly not here today to judge whether any of these recent trends are good histories of science to write. I could not. But I shall make use of this occasion to show what the history of early science, as we attempt to write it in my research group, is indeed a good history of science to write. I will show that it is good in at least three respects, with decreasing modesty. First, it is good in terms of its thematic focus on the role of experience in early science. Second, it is good in terms of its thematic impact on the current narratives about the relationship between early science and early modern science. And third, and most importantly, I will show that it holds the potential to provide a much needed methodological unity to the discipline of the history of science as a whole. In what follows, I proceed in 3 steps. First, I turn to the historical beginnings of the history of science and the ongoing practical turn. Then I will move to 2 examples from my own research. I first cover experience as an object of investigation and practices of theorizing, and then move to the role of listening and experience for science in my actors. I finish my talk with some concluding remarks. Okay, the historical beginnings of the history of science and the ongoing practical turn. The history of science took its shape as a discipline in the US in 2 formative establishments: the founding of the journal ISIS in 1913 and the founding of HSS in 1924. The ISIS version I found online is the one from 1914, so a year later. I apologize for that. At the time, the discipline was built on the shoulders of some of the finest historians of science who have shaped our understanding of what they call medieval science to this day. These founding fathers include George Sarton, Charles Homer Haskins, Lynn Thorndike, and Edwin A. Burt. What seemed to unite these historians of medieval science was 2 contrasting aims: to write a history of scientific continuity, as in the case of Thorndike, for instance, or a history of metaphysical discontinuity, as in the case of Burt. Now, Burt is a particularly interesting case, not just for medieval science. As an astute reader of Pierre Duhem's work, Burt paid less attention to Duhem's history of the gradual anti-Aristotelian changes than to Duhem's history of metaphysical discontinuity between the medieval and the modern worlds. In his book, Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Physical Science, Burt postulated a, quote, metaphysical contrast between medieval and modern thought in respect to their conception of man's relation to his natural environment, unquote. Burt identified a sentiment, or master ontology, between man and world for the medieval scientist, and a ressentiment, or slave ontology, between man and the world for the modern scientist. Now, Burt's reading of a, quote, metaphysical contrast between medieval and modern thought, unquote, did not go unnoticed by Alexandre Coiré, who most famously coined the concept of the scientific revolution in his book, From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe. And this book, as we all know, was a decisive inspiration for Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In short, the discipline of the history of science in some of its beginnings was solidly built on histories that included reflections on medieval science and the medieval worldview. Now, it cannot be overemphasized that this fact had strong repercussions on the methodology of the early years of the history of science too, even though the inspiration that Coiré took from Burt usually goes unnoticed. Much of what the cultural, practical, and material turns turned against was present in these early histories. Linear narratives on continuity or discontinuity, or even worse, prehistories, theory-centeredness, and narratives together with internalisms or externalisms, or versus the two, one against the other, insistence on universal criteria for demarcating science from non-science, hero narratives, and so on. And so it seems that with the charges against the pioneering histories of medieval science itself vanished into thin air. That's obviously overpainting the picture. So it appears to me, is certainly true for the role of early science, for the methodology of the history of science. Indeed, the large majority of historians of science who made the 3 turns possible hardly ever touched medieval science in their work. And when they did so more for the fringes of early science, including, for instance, alchemy and the artis mechanicae and the household. Now, I should add that the fate of early modern science was a very different one. Here, Chapin and Schaeffer, Dameron and Lefebvre, Hacking, Guerini, and more recently Rankin, Wherret, Leong, and Rampling, and of course Lorraine Daston, to name just a few, have all turned practical. And they have done so on the basis of a specific understanding of practice, namely practice as an empirical practice. Now, this understanding of practice as an empirical practice has some of its own weaknesses. I will just name what I consider the 2 most important ones. First, it opposes practice to theory. Second, it limits practice to the empirical. But I wonder what the foundations of such an opposition and limitation are. The opposition certainly cannot come from the practical turn in the history of science and the methodological norms that it carries. For in principle, the practical turn ought to be open to describing everything that is procedural in science as practice. Moreover, the limitation to empirical practices cannot come from here either for similar reasons. Writing, speaking, listening, and even theorizing are all practices too, even though they're not empirical. So the opposition between practice and theory and the limitation to empirical practice must have come from the historical actors and the sources. But did they really? I'm not sure. It seems to me then that the practical turns that have been realized so far have only been taken partially. They have been taken partially because they're still based on a view of science that restricts itself to those epistemic norms present in the earliest history of science, and especially to the empirical method. But wasn't this precisely the restriction that the practical turn wished to overcome? The bottom line for me then is, for the history of science as a whole, the practical turn is yet to be fully realized in all its facets. And this is precisely where my research group enters the picture. With our research, we're currently among those historians of science who are spearheading the full realization of the practical turn in the history of science. And we do so in three precise ways of intervention. First, we conceive of scientific practices in the widest possible sense. We explicitly include scientific practices other than the empirical practices, such as oral practices, textual practices, and thinking practices, and we study them in their intricate relations to one another. Second, under this conception of practices, theory is no longer opposed to practice. Theory is no longer an ontologically, statically, universally absolute, or said as such. Rather, theory is just like any other practice, an epistemically mutable process that comes about through different scientific actions, interventions by science, and actions and interventions by scientists. In short, theorizing as scientific practice, as we view it in my group, is constituted by different practices depending on different epistemic norms at different times and different spaces. Third, we conceive of science in a much narrower sense than other developments, especially the one in the history of knowledge. Even if science is to be understood as a process in and of culture, then it still remains something distinct from other forms of knowledge, not necessarily for us, but for our historical actors. We take the demarcations that our historical actors make with regard to science seriously, even if the historical actors sometimes understand something very different by science than we do. And of course, it goes without saying that we debate much about this point, but at every instance, we aim at maximally transparent descriptive accounts of science in opposition to prescriptive or even silently prescriptive accounts. In short, our intervention does nothing less than reconsider the relationships between science and practice. Moreover, only as a consequence of this reconsideration is it possible to study our current theme of investigation, experience in the sciences of soul and body from 800 to 1650. Indeed, only as a consequence of this reconsideration is it possible to chart the precise role that experience had in early science. This, of course, results in an entirely new way of understanding experience in early science, and it is now free to be appreciated without the bias and expectation of attempting to find the empirical method. Experience as an object of investigation and practices of theorizing. I now come to my two examples from my very own research. Let me begin my first example by quoting a famous passage from Aristotle's Metaphysics. In this passage, Aristotle describes the role that experience has on the path to episteme, that is, scientific knowledge in the Greek sense of the word. I quote, "It is from memory that men acquire experience, because numerous memories of the same thing eventually produce the effect of a single experience. Experience seems very similar to science and art, but actually it is through experience that men acquire science and art. Art is produced when from many notions of experience, a single universal judgment is formed with regard to like objects, unquote. Historians of science have usually made reference to this passage in Aristotle's work to paint a sharp contrast between medieval theory about experience and early modern empirical practice that took no recourse to this passage, but was perhaps inspired by it. But let us see what's in the text. Aristotle here and in the text just before describes the process by which humans acquire knowledge of the universal from the particular. He lists 5 stages. The first is sense perception, that's not in this passage. The second, imagination. The third, memory. The fourth, experience. And the fifth, finally, is the universal. Many sense perceptions generate one imagination. Many imaginations, one memory. Many memories, one experience. And many experiences, one universal. The universal is episteme, scientific knowledge in the sense of true and certain knowledge about a specific kind. 2 things are crucial to keep in mind. First, experience here is not a practice, it is an object of theorizing. Second, experience as such object is understood in a highly technical sense. It describes a cognitive state in the scientist that has already been preceded by sense perception, imagination, and memory. But what happened when this short passage reached the Latin scholastic audience? In the 12th century, this passage was translated from Greek into Latin 4 times, in 2 incomplete and in 2 complete translations. The 2 complete translations were subject to commentaries by Latin thinkers from the 13th century onward. Albert the Great commented on the first complete translation, the Translatio Media. The later generations commented on the second complete translation, the Revisio Morbecana. It is important to mention these 2 translations because they do not translate the Greek in the same way. When it comes to the passage from many experiences to the universal, the first translation translates, I quote, from many things understood through experience. So many things understood through experience, there arises one universal apprehension of similar things, unquote. In contrast, the revision of Morbecca translates, I quote, from many experiential conceptions, there arises one universal apprehension of similar things, unquote. One may think this difference between from many things understood through experience and from many experiential conceptions is trivial, but it was not for the Latin audience. To understand this point, let us look at the words in more detail. The Latin verb intelligere, understanding, had a technical meaning for the scholastic audience. As some of you may know, intelligere was a cognitive activity for the Latin audience that was limited to the intellect. Now, the intellect was generally considered a faculty or power that was ontologically separate from the powers of sensation, memory, and experience. It was still part of the soul for most Latin thinkers, but it was separate from those lower powers. The intellect was the power that was higher than the sense powers. In consequence, the first translation seemed to suggest to the Latin audience that many experiences were insufficient to generate a universal on their own. Rather, the intellect had to be involved to produce a universal together with experience. The second translation, in contrast, did not suggest this. On the contrary, for Morbecca, many experiential conceptions were sufficient to generate one universal. So what happened in the practices of theorizing about this passage among the different Latin audience? Albert the Great, about whom I could say a lot, but I'll limit myself to his date of birth and death, 1200 to 1280. And perhaps I should say he was, as far as I know, the only scholastic thinker who commented on all of Aristotle's works and thus composed an entire corpus of philosophical scientia. So Albert the Great commented on the first translation, and naturally he followed the text closely. For him, the universal does not arise from experience alone. Rather, it arises from the simultaneous involvement of experience and the universal that is already in the intellect of the scientist. Albert comments, quote, "But art arises and is generated and perfected in us when from many things, not confused, to be sure no longer confused, through experience by the purification of a universal concept, by true and certain reason, one universal apprehension arises, abstracted of all similar things in an essential way," unquote. Now, this sentence is, as you can imagine, full of technical details of Albert's epistemology, and I will spare you the details. But I wish to make one point. Albert took the wording of the first translation as epistemically decisive for his practices of theorizing in all of natural philosophy. For Albert, physics, cosmology, astronomy, mineralogy, and the life sciences followed this path of cognition as and when experience was involved. This path suggested once again that the prior, more generic universal was necessary together with experience to yield a posterior, more specific one. Thus, Albert determined a particular order of study in the natural sciences. The scientia of physics had to come first because it was the science of the most generic universals. He then taught increasingly more specific sciences of non-living natural beings until he arrived to mineralogy, the most specific one. Then again, Albert moved from the most universal scientia of living beings to the most specific one, the science on plants and animals, or botany and zoology, as we would call it today. So in short, Albert mapped his theorizations about experience in this passage onto a particular epistemic order of doing scientia in the classroom. Albert's practices of theorizing about experience here were informed by his practices of commenting and teaching to the extent that he made them both epistemically congruous with one another. His theorizations about experience show that his understanding of experience was not principally bound to an empirical method or practice. On the contrary, his theorizations about experience were bound to the classroom that conveyed scientia to the student. But the classroom also had its limits in Albert's eyes, for it could often not convey scientia on the most specific level of universals. And this is precisely where either direct or transmitted experiences enter the picture. For him, every scientist who was educated in the complete corpus of natural science was in the position to generate specific universals out of experience together with prior universals in his mind. Where these experiences actually entered into Albert's natural philosophy is a question that I will answer in the second example that I give to a certain extent. For now, I wish to contrast on Albert's practices of theorizing in this passage with the practices of theorizing that we find in John Buridan. So John Buridan is a famous logician. He was born in 1300 and died in 1361. Actually, Pablo, you can go to the next slide if you want to. Sorry about this. He is well known for his nominalist positions. As you will see, when he commented on this passage, he did not have the classroom in mind in his conception of experience, but rather medical practice. In his first commentary on the metaphysics, Buridan wrote two of them. So it seems Buridan took inspiration from the second Greek to Latin translation. There, in Mabecca's Revisio, many experiential conceptions could generate one universal. Now, Buridan took inspiration from Mabecca's use of experiential conceptions and thought of them as operative in sensitive cognition that mirrors intellectual cognition in its approach. Experiential cognition, as Buridan called it, hooks onto what has been sensed long before and stored away in memory. This relation is possible by an association of similar properties between the memory and the object of sense perception in front of the scientist. Take fire, for instance. Experiential cognition for Buridan is, quote, when you have never touched this particular fire and nonetheless you know it to be hot, unquote. I think it holds for stoves nowadays still, that when you go into someone's house, you know that the stove is hot if the stove is turned on. Anyway, Buridan thus insists on a kind of inductive method. I quote again. If someone sees one time that this particular rhubarb purges the bile, he does not immediately judge with certainty that another rhubarb also purges the bile, but if he sees it many times without exception, then he assents to the other case, unquote. And more, experiential knowledge, I quote again, is certain and infallible if it is confirmed on the basis of exceedingly many sense perceptions and memories, together with a reflection on the memories, circumstances, evidence of the art, etc. Otherwise, experiences are fallacious, unquote. To historians of early modern science, Buridan's theorization about experience here may sound like a pretty standard one, but judging against the background of his predecessors, Buridan's theorization was anything but standard. First, he extended the epistemic criteria of invariability and recurrence that were once reserved for intellectual cognition to experiential cognition. This meant that he interpreted this passage to speak about induction in the sense as he knew it from medical practice. This stands in sharp contrast to Albert, whose main inspiration came from the first translation and the order of study in the classroom. Second, Buridan thus negated the interpretive hegemony of scientia over its object of investigation, in this case experience. Rather than accepting the authority of the text and the intellectual practices of the classroom, the activities of teaching, Buridan turned elsewhere to explain the role of experience. In other words, he derived his knowledge about experience from medical empirical practice rather than from textual and oral practices. This brief comparison of different theorizations about experience in Albert and Buridan shows two things. First, that there was no unanimity over the epistemic norms that guided these practices of theorizing. Quite the contrary. Albert insisted on the role of the classroom, Buridan on the role of empirical practice. Second, this comparison also shows that theorizations about experience were at least as important to Albert and Buridan as the use of experience. In fact, in both cases, experience remained subject to practices of theorizing, despite the fact that it was associated with different epistemic values for the making of science. For Buridan especially, this shows that theorizing remained a decisive epistemic practice that was not suddenly superseded by an empirical practice. But what could be a reason for this? I give a possible answer that turns to examining in greater detail the practice of theorizing. But this answer brings us back to Albert the Great, since he sought an integration of the practice of theorizing with experience through the perceptual process of listening. Okay, the second example, the role of listening and experience for science. So far, I have explained that for Albert, knowledge about experience came from textual and oral practices in the classroom and his study. But did experience also play an instrumental role in these practices? And if so, how? The short answer is simple, yes. It did through the perceptual processes of listening to speech. The long answer that I now provide is more complicated. Now, listening was a perceptual process that stood at the heart of the medieval classroom practices of theorizing. Listening was a cognitive process that every scientist and every future scientist engaged in, and that procedurally grounded the rational methodologies of definition and demonstration. The Aristotelian dictum that all knowledge begins in the senses was therefore not only pertinent to medieval theories of perception and thinking, but it also played an overarching role in the medieval scientific practices, most notably in the form of listening. Listening to lectures, lecturing and debating in the public and private constituted the predominant practices of thinking of medieval students and scholars alike. These, chiefly auditory practices, have come down to us mostly in medieval manuscripts, which I view as silent witnesses to a loud scholarly live world. For the medievals, listening was the perceptual process that would lead to scientia in the classroom, while seeing was its equivalent outside of the classroom. But it should be noted that they could yield the same results, if pursued in the right way, of course. Thus, both routes to scientia, the route of doctrina, or listening to teachings, and the route of inventio, namely seeing things in the world, were considered legitimate. But they required different kinds of perceptual practices and experiences. In the following, I focus on Albert the Great, again, to show how he took the process of listening to include experience and to lead to scientific knowledge. Just like many of his immediate predecessors, Albert the Great celebrated the process of listening to speech as conducive of sensia, particularly for young people, who in his eyes were suited for the study of mathematics, but neither for natural philosophy nor for metaphysics. The process of listening was indispensable. It was indispensable for them because they had to overcome their inexperience and to proceed to becoming a wise man. I quote, while young people can listen to mathematics, no, actually, I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, sorry. While young people can listen to mathematics, natural science, and metaphysics, they nonetheless do not acquire full confidence or certainty in listening, as you can see in the passages on the slide. The reason that Albert states for this weakness is the natural disposition of the intellect to be drawn to intelligibles that are suitable or proportionate to their own intellect. Only later, through much experience, can the intellect of young people proceed to acquiring scientific knowledge from objects that are disproportionate to their intellect, either from below, so from objects of sense perception, or from above, as from the objects of metaphysics through the meditation of sensible objects. Here we go. I quote a passage in Albert, but the intelligibles, that's the second one on the slide, the intelligibles are scattered in sensible things, and they are in need of much combination and in need of comparison for a while and in need of many examinations before they may be trusted with certainty. The quotation goes on, it is similar with those things that are disproportionate to the human intellect, since those things which precede the human intellect are acquired by it through posterior things, namely through effects and signs, which must also be experienced from particulars and singulars. Therefore, things pertaining to wisdom are not acquired by a young person with certainty, unquote. So the intelligibles that are conveyed by speech can bridge the gap of the disproportionality between object and intellect in natural science. The spoken intelligibles are proportionate to the intellect. As a consequence, they safeguard the acquisition of natural science even for the young people. Albert readily admits that these intelligibles, when acquired through sight, are scattered in sensible things. As such, they lead to science only with the aid of the additional cognitive processes of combination, comparison, and examination over time, something that the young people cannot yet confidently do. Albert thus considered the mastery and use of these additional processes to distinguish an expert listener from a novice listener to scientia. I quote, erudition is cognition and education by which something without ignorance is placed into the intellect. And therefore the proper listener, judging the speeches that have been set forth, must be an expert. The acquired ability to judge truth from error arises as the distinguishing criterion between the inexperienced and the experienced listener. While the inexperienced listener cannot judge the truth of the subject matter confidently, the experienced listener can readily rely on his own expertise and judge accordingly. But there's more in Albert. In his zoology, Albert took the expertise of the listener to extend not only to the subject matter at hand, but also to the way of communicating scientia. I quote, it is the task of the expert listener to judge the defining speeches made by someone who says something by way of a definition. And it is also his task to judge the speeches discoursing and demonstrating that something of the common or proper accidents accrues to a living being. For the prudent listener judges whether there is truth in these words or whether there was some error in them, and if something seems to be true even though it's false. For it is to be believed with certainty that every teacher who teaches, listens to, and judges the things heard must have this disposition in his activity of judging and this power of a ruling and forming habit in his judgment that he provides concerning the knowledge of living beings. The expert listener possesses the capacity to judge whether the subject matter expressed in speech is true or false. In so doing, he can rely on his ruling and forming habit, his acquired experience in comparing and examining over time in a given scientia. But the expert also possesses this habit and experience with regard to judging any given speech on the subject matter. He knows how speech as instrument or method is used to tell the truth, about living beings or not. Albert located this kind of instrumental expertise in the technical armor of the organon, so Aristotle's logical works, as he knew and interpreted them in their relevance for his zoology. But the methodological criteria laid down here, the expert listener had to judge the definitions of living beings given by the speaker, and he had to judge the spoken demonstrations given about the accidents that accrue to the living beings. These methodological criteria thus ensured the indispensable relation that the expert listener had to the objects of scientia, the living beings in the world, and the truthfulness of the given speech. But they did so only if the expert listener actually possessed the expertise he claimed to have. That is, if his expertise was literally anchored in his soul by a habit. This may be considered a weakness in the whole system, particularly when Albert conceded that, quote, it is to be believed with certainty that every teacher, unquote, is in possession of the two kinds of expertise. But what looks like a weakness was actually a strength. Certainly, expertise and the ability of listening and judging properly by way of the correct rational methods were bound to the auditory processes, the acquisition, application, and transmission of scientia and its truth, subject matter, and expertise were distinctly bound to the cognition in the expert, who was usually a teacher. Even more so, they were bound to the relationship between teacher and student in the auditory processes conventionalized in the different forms of lecture and debate, and in the university's classroom as a whole. Listening, therefore, was the single perceptual process that Albert privileged for the making of scientia, not as objective enterprise, but as something that perfected the scientist. In short, the material instrument of speech opened a direct link to intellectual cognition and a direct route to scientia. The formalized instrument, the tools of Aristotle's logical works, the organon, determined and limited how the application of speech was to be ordered on this direct route. And expertise in teaching and judgment ensured the right use of these instruments and the arrival at the goal. The acquired perceptual process of listening in the right way held these instruments and expertise together and anchored all three of them in a socially shared practice of theorizing. Nonetheless, particular insights into the nature of animals, for example, could also be had by another cognitive process, vision by experience. As its own identifiable perceptual process, it developed its own instrumentality and expertise. And this instrumentality and expertise were much closer to what later came to be the empirical method. Still, Albert's integration of the practice of theorizing with experience through listening reveals yet another epistemic role of experience, that of expertise and judgments about scientific objects and speeches. In a way, this seems to be still valid today in scientific practice. For instance, when we go to conferences, do we not also judge about the scientific objects and the speeches that are being given? But how is this type of cognitive expertise represented in the histories of science? I now come to my concluding remarks. I began my talk today with 3 questions. What history of science is good to write and why? What role can early science play in such history? And how does our work on experience in early science contribute to writing a good history of science and why? Let me address these questions in reverse order. Our work on experience in early science has helped us remove the expectations of empirical practices and exchange them for a notion of practices for wider and more inclusive. It has opened up a space in which practices of theorizing, listening and speaking, orality and textuality find their due place in the history of science, early science. Our work on experience in early science is turning the history of science practical, full speed. Now, some of you may wish to object and claim the limitations of these practices for early science alone. But I hope that one example may suffice to counter such an objection. Hannah Landecker, the historian of modern life science, has recently identified 3 desiderata for the history of science from her own viewpoint of a completely different subject of investigation. First, in the paper that I have on the very right on the slide, it's the front page. First, she wonders about the possibility for intellectual history to go practical. The research that my group has done so far shows not only that this request can be tackled, but also how. We show that theorizing is as much a practice as observing and experimenting, and that the analytic concept of practice to analyze science need not be reduced to empirical practices. Second, Landecker wonders how we can turn away from case studies to large-scale histories. Our research around epistemic culture is something I have not had the time to talk about today, provides a viable solution to this request as well. But it centers on cultures across time and space, in which certain epistemic practices take the lead over others in relation to the science that is being made. Third, Landecker wonders whether the making of science does not also happen in writing, teaching, communication, visualization, cognition, and emotions. Now, I hope to have shown with my examples today that our research shows precisely that, and also how these non-empirical practices that are the bread and butter of early science, and in fact, that early science could not be envisioned without them. Now, for our subfield, the early sciences of soul and body, we have already gone beyond Landecker's desiderata. Here, we have begun to identify the different types of non-empirical practices. We have begun to chart the precise relationships that they have to one another, and we have begun to link them to the notion of experience in early science, our current object of investigation. The two examples I presented today from my research were primarily aimed at showing in detail how we have gone about the full practical turn in the history of science. Of course, they are not representative of the breadth of the research that is done in my group. The projects that have been running so far have included many spaces around the globe of early science. The ancient Greek world, the Arabic world, the Chinese world, the Sanskrit world, the Latin world, and the vernacular languages have all been covered in our projects. In the following, I can only briefly touch on those projects of our research that are led by our postdocs, and only some select ones. Hannah Erwin's project on Arabic ilm in Falsafa and Kalam has sought to map the practice of analogical reasoning from experienceable phenomena to the unexperienceable realm. Shixiang Jin's project has followed the fate of translation practices around the concept xiang and the limits the translations brought from Latin to Chinese. Jonathan Morton, who's now assistant professor at Tulane University, has studied medieval fictional practices and their potential to generate hypothetical experiences. Meenakshi Menon has worked on disentangling the epistemic norms behind practices of describing plants in the Hortus Malabaricus, a 12-volume survey of the floral riches of the Malayalam-speaking parts of Southwest India. Julia Reed's project on reforming medicine has charted different practices of imagining the relationships between nature, purpose, and medicine anew in early modern Europe. Dror Weil, who's now at the University of Cambridge, outlined practices of transmission of medical knowledge from Arabic and Persian lands to China. Tracy Witeka's project on Latin American natural knowledge has narrated the practices of incorporating new empirical evidence into a traditional body of medical teachings. Anne-Maria Avsentevskaya has thought a lot about practices of translating within and between languages. We have also had 9 more projects by visiting senior scholars and 7 projects by pre-doctoral fellows, both affiliated and visiting. Please look at our website for more details and have a look especially at the project of our pre-docs, Dominic Dole, Yuan Tao, and Wenrei Zhao. As this selection of projects covering vastly different spaces and times of early science shows, my research group is well on its way to preparing a good number of publications on experience. But the group is also shaping the next generation of scholars in the history of science in a rigorous and creative way, as we will continue to write the history of science on the virtuous foundations that it has had over the past century. This is where I see our contribution to the history of science, taking the practical turn. But there's more. Reflecting simply on the German name of our discipline, Wissenschaftsgeschichte, Sorry for looking at the German and not the English. This name leaves in principle two ways of thinking about the relationship between history and science. It can either refer to a history that is written of or about science, or to a history that is written with or by means of science. The German name is sufficiently ambiguous to leave both options open. What the name only implies, but what early science reveals, I would say like no other period, is that behind every science, it is people, the scientists who make the science in and through their practices. What early science helps us appreciate, perhaps more than modern science with its vast body of technology, is that science would not have a history if it were not for the scientists. Now, this is not to say that scientific practices are not equally inscribed in the scientific instruments and objects. It is simply to say that they are at least as much inscribed also in the subjects of science. A history of science that takes into account all three relata, subjects, objects, and instruments, without predetermining any epistemic hierarchy or relation among them is, at least in my interpretation, what Hannah Landecker demands us to do when she speaks of the three desiderata. And it is probably also a reason why Ludwig Fleck's Denkkollektiv and Denkstil are gaining traction again. What our work on early science can and does do is to reactivate the human element in the making of science and the cognitive and intellectual practices in particular. Every turn in the history of science has emphasized an aspect about science that was undervalued in the previous histories of science. But every turn has by implication undervalued aspects about science that these previous histories emphasized. The turns, therefore, have brought with them also negations, exclusions, and omissions. What my group does is not to invoke a new turn. It is not our purpose to negate, exclude, or omit. On the contrary, it is our purpose to recuperate what was virtuous and valuable in the past, but what might have been lost. Such a reactivation is elementary for writing a good history of science. It is elementary, especially with regard to the scientists, because these elements of cognitive and intellectual practices are much needed, I would say, for synthetic histories of science. And such synthetic histories of science are much needed also for our societies at large, because they will, to a great extent, determine our visions of the future. Cybernetics, biorobotics, or quantum computing, one of them will perhaps provoke the next turn in the history of science. What is it that we will leave behind then when they come? Will we then leave behind the historians of science who are currently still writing the history of science? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Katja, for your talk. I think with this, we have hit the end of today's session and of the Institute's Colloquium series for this year. But thank you once again, Katja, for your very illuminating, very fascinating talk on the research that you and your group have been doing over the last 2 years. That was really quite excellent. Since even though today's session was a bit different from the previous ones, this is still the last session for this academic year, so I wanted to add a round of thank yous to the people who made this possible, including our colleagues from the library and our colleagues from the communications and media team, and thank you also to all of you for having tuned with us for all these months. And thanks, of course, to Stephanie Hood and Lisa Onaga, co-organizers of this year's Colloquium series. That's it for this year. Hopefully see you all soon, and hopefully they'll be in person